Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our virtual educational event. I am Lisa McCown from Beyond Clean. Before we get started with this next presentation, I'd like to call everyone's attention to the features on your screen. All the windows that you see are movable, so feel free to shrink, enlarge, or move them around to make your event experience fit your preferences. On the lower left, you'll see a Q&A window. Throughout each presentation, we encourage you to send in your questions for the speaker to answer during our Q&A session. In the upper right, you'll see a resources window where you'll find additional resources to download and access that are provided to you by our event sponsor, 3M. So don't forget, you'll also find free bonus CE content for today's conference in the resources window. Our next speaker has become a regular at Beyond Clean events because of his engaging presentation style and his extensive knowledge of instrument care. Michael Matthews is the Director of Customer-Facing Training and Education for Agility. Mike is Lean Six Sigma Green Belt certified and one of the most down-to-earth, easy to listen to educators that leaves you with specific, actionable steps to improve your department and approach to instrument care. Differentiating between rust and staining on stainless steel instrumentation is tricky business for any frontline technician. Never fear, Mike is here to help us discover the techniques you can use to help identify the various types of stains and rust found on your stainless steel instruments. Are instrument stains and rust preventable? Tune in now to discover the truth behind the stains. Please join me in welcoming Michael Matthews.
Excellent. Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction. It is my sincere pleasure to be here. I really enjoy doing these types of events. I'm the beneficiary of having always a pretty good relationship with my OR staff. I come from sterile processing. And I love the OR. I love working with technicians. I love working with the nurses, the scrub techs, everybody in there. And this is just a true pleasure and joy to be able to be here and speak to you today. And today we're going to be talking about rust and staining. And I know that the title of the presentation probably raises a few eyebrows because everybody thinks, wow, this is kind of an unusual presentation title. Considering we're at, these more formal educational conferences and stuff. But there's a reason for the title. One of my management jobs, in fact, actually it was my last management job, I was opening a new facility. And one of my responsibilities as a sterile processing manager at a brand new facility was to order all of the instruments that were going to be used in surgery. So I ordered every single instrument that was used in this particular facility, which was a lot of fun. And especially what's cool about it is that if you are an instrument nerd like me, you know that when you open a brand new instrument, there's just nothing like it. I mean, it's just, they're so pretty, they're so shiny, everything about them looks so perfect. And I had entire sets of new instruments. One of the most fun things that we would do is when we were onboarding surgeons, the surgeons would come into our sterile processing area and we would have every instrument set that they would potentially use laid out for them. And I knew beyond the shadow of a doubt, these were the best looking instrument sets these surgeons had ever seen in their careers. And that was a lot of fun. And they were just so pretty, so pristine. But as we started to kind of get things ramped up and as we were getting ready to begin doing surgeries, we were running instruments through our washers and through our autoclaves and getting things prepared for opening day. And it did not take long for our instruments to start looking kind of dingy. They had kind of this weird stain on them. And immediately I was like, dude, what happened to my beautiful, perfect instrument sets that I was so proud of? And now all of a sudden that they look not that great anymore. And what we're going to be talking about today is, what happened to those instruments. And this has a potential impact on the OR as well, because I'm betting that, my OR personnel who are also looking at those instruments when they pulled instruments out of these sets and they were expecting to be perfect, pristine, and nice and shiny, and they come out and come looking a little dingy, they say, hey, what happened to your instruments? And I know I've talked to many OR personnel, nurses, scrub techs who, they come to us sometimes with concerns and say, hey, these instruments have these stains on them. Is this safe for patient care? What happens? Is this dangerous? And we're going to talk about all of those things and really get to the root causes, and then especially talk about how you as OR personnel can help prevent a lot of these things from happening. Now, some of those you can help, some of them you can't, but we'll differentiate between the two. So let me go. All right, there we go. So our goals and objectives today is we're going to distinguish between rust and staining, and then we're going to look at the root causes for those two things while also examining what is the potential risk to those patients. So let's dive in. Okay, so why does this matter? First of all, there is a tremendous amount of money that is invested in your facility's stainless steel instruments. In fact, about 75% of all instruments that are utilized in a facility are made of stainless steel. And so when we talk about financial impacts of instruments, obviously everybody's mind goes to the really expensive things like rigid scopes, cameras, flexible scopes, and that's understandable because individually those are very expensive. But when you consider the volume of how many instruments, how many stainless steel instruments you have in your facility, we're talking about something that touches every single patient that comes in and out of the OR. And so this has tremendous impact on the financial viability of the hospital. And if there is a problem that can affect patients, it's something that will affect every patient that comes in and out of your OR. So tremendous amount of financial opportunity here, and as well as risk to those patients. So, and as we kind of distinguish between staining and rusting, staining can decrease the lifespan of the instruments. It can also make the instruments more difficult to inspect for dangerous bioburden. And then particular types of staining can affect how well that instrument functions during the procedure. And then when we start talking about rust, which is different, we're talking about catastrophic failure to that instrument where it is no longer safe for patient use and has to be replaced, can't be repaired, but has to be replaced. And so we'll get all into the explaining what those things are and how to distinguish between them. Okay, so kind of from a high level view, we are talking about two different things when we talk about rust and staining. Sometimes it's real easy to get those two confused, but we will help differentiate between the two. But at kind of like a high level, first thing we want you to know about staining is typically, I'm going to put an asterisk on this, typically it is not a risk to patients. Now there is a particular type of staining that is a risk to patients. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but generally speaking, if you've got some staining on your instruments, that is not an immediate risk to those patients. So everybody can kind of take a breath of relief and say, okay, all right, my anxiety level's down a little bit. I know that we've got some staining on our instruments, and I have not been putting patients at risk through using stained instruments. So we'll get into that, the nuances of that conversation, but generally speaking, it is not an immediate risk to patients. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about all the various root causes when it comes to staining, because tracking down the specific root cause at your facility is very, very difficult. And it will vary from facility to facility. And actually, it can even vary within the same facility just based on the time of year. So lots of different ways that stains can happen on your instruments, and it can be very difficult to track down what your specific problem is. But generally speaking, one of the best ways that you can mitigate staining is through regular maintenance, preventive maintenance. Now, when it comes to rust, this one is a very significant area of concern because this can be a risk to patients. And we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. But the one good thing I can say about rusting is, unlike staining that can have literally dozens of potential causes, rust, there's really only a handful of options. And really most of them boil down to just one thing. And we'll get into that. But if you've got a rusting problem, it's pretty easy to track down what that root cause most of the time is. Now, the downside of that is that once we have rust coming from an instrument, usually that instrument is dead, can't be repaired, has to be replaced. And that makes finding that root cause really critically important, because if we're having to replace instruments that's a lot of excess cost for our facilities. So we want to identify what that root cause is, and we want to identify it so that we can fix it, so that we aren't having to put patients at risk and we aren't having to replace those instruments as well. Okay, so time for a chemistry lesson. I know that's what everybody wants to hear at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, but we are going to dive into some chemistry. When it comes to stainless steel, we need to understand some basic things about stainless steel. I've actually had arguments with surgeons about stainless steel because there is this general conception that anything that is made of stainless steel is just, they're all the same. Stainless steel is stainless steel, and that is just quite simply not true. There are literally dozens of different formulations of what makes a stainless steel instrument, and this is why, for those of you who are experienced scrub techs, I could blindfold you, put a single-use stainless steel instrument in one hand and a standard surgical grade stainless steel instrument in another hand, and you would immediately be able to tell me which is which just based on the feel. Why is that? Well, it's because of how the stainless steel is formulated gives it different properties. But regardless, something that's universal for all of them is stainless steel is an alloy. It is a metal that is mixed with something else, and all the different something else's are what gives it its property. But what's important for us in this conversation is that all stainless steel instruments are about 70% iron. And iron loves to rust, like that's what it wants to do. And the other 30% is going to affect how well it resists that. Okay. So one of the things that gets added to stainless steel that makes it stainless steel is the addition of chromium. Now, like I said, iron wants to combine with oxygen, and it wants to combine with that oxygen to form what we call iron oxide. And iron oxide is rust. And this is the most stable form of iron. It's what iron wants to do, and we all know what rust looks like. It's like this powdery, useless material. But when we add chromium to the mix, chromium also likes to combine with oxygen. But unlike iron oxide, chromium oxide is very hard. It is water repellent. It's what makes stainless steel stainless steel. It's what makes it viable to be able to be used in all the applications that we have. And so we call this the passive layer. And we call it the passive layer because it forms passively as the chromium on the surface of the instrument is exposed to oxygen in the air or oxygen from water in the washers. It slowly builds itself up over time. And because that because that chromium oxide layer is there on top of the instrument, it's preventing oxygen from getting to the iron underneath. And that's what keeps stainless steel from rusting. And so this is a really awesome, powerful concept because this is what makes stainless steel so good at what it does. This is why it's able to be used like this. But one little caveat I'll give to you about that is because the passive layer is created by the interaction with oxygen and it gets stronger over time, what that means is that newer instruments are actually more vulnerable to damage than older instruments. So it's very kind of backwards thinking. So this is something I learned as part of my management when I was opening a new hospital and ordering thousands of new instruments. When you order that many instruments, you inevitably get some that are back orders. And what that means is they ran out of them at the warehouse. And so as soon as they're getting manufactured in Germany, they are being sent directly to you at your facility. Now, when that happens, those instruments, they haven't been alive very long, and so they have not had a long time to build that passive layer up and get it really strong. And as a result, their passive layer tends to be very thin and more vulnerable to damage. And I guarantee you, I could go into every facility and I'll find like extremely old instruments that somehow are still in great shape. They still function great. They have no rusting on them whatsoever. They look fantastic. And so, why is that? Well, because they're older, they've had more time to be exposed to the oxygen, and so their passive layer has gotten a lot stronger. So Newer instruments, especially when they've been back ordered, will actually give you more trouble than older instruments. Okay, so now that we understand what the passive layer is, that it is this nanometers thin layer of protection that protects iron underneath from exposure to oxygen and keeps it from rusting, now we can understand what is staining. Well, staining is the buildup of a substance on top of the layer of chromium oxide. So it sits on top of that top layer. Now, what that buildup is could be a lot of different things, and that's where figuring out which kind of stain we have really kind of comes into play, because it could be any of these things. It could be minerals like calcium or silica. It could be organic materials like old bioburden. Now, remember back when I said not typically a risk to patients, and I said put an asterisk on that, this one is the one that kind of breaks that. Because if you've got old bioburden stains on your instruments, that is absolutely a risk to patients. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but that one's the most concerning one. Even though it's not the most common. The most common is definitely the mineral buildups. It can be other residues like old adhesives or cleaning chemicals will sometimes leave behind residues. If you've ever taken instrument tape off of an instrument and you see kind of like that layer of just brown gunk, what is that? Well, that's the adhesive left behind that's sitting on top of that passive layer. There's even a very rare type of staining called galvanic oxidization, which can happen just kind of through some weird circumstances. It's pretty rare, but it is possible, and we will spend a little bit of time talking about that. Now, let's look at mineral stains a little bit more specifically, because this is the most common form of staining on your instruments. In fact, this is the type of staining that I had to deal with when I was opening my new facilities that caused me to say, hey, what happened to my instruments? Well, it turns out that when you're in my geographical area and you have a huge new construction, it takes a really long time for the sand in the soil to get out of the water pipes. And we did not know that. And what had happened was that the silica from the water had completely overwhelmed our water filters. They were supposed to last for 6 months, and they were completely shot in less than 1 month. And so that kind of dingy, gross looking buildup on the instruments was actually just silicates. It was sand. And we did not know that at the time, and we learned it. So, this happens, especially if you've got a new construction, new water pipes sometimes bring in a lot of sediments with them, and that can definitely cause that staining. Now, other stains like calcium, that can be a buildup just from excess calcium in the water. Sands, like I talked about. There can be other minerals like potassium, magnesium. Regardless, though, of which one we're talking about at your facility, the root cause of this is exposure to hard water. Now, a lot of facilities have figured out that hard water, like they know they need to use some form of deionized or reverse osmosis treated water in their washers, but then they will turn right around and stick their instruments into an autoclave that gets its steam supply from the house steam, which is fed by the municipal water, right? Tap water. So you're just being exposed to the same stuff. So using the reverse osmosis in your washers, good thing, but you're still just adding it right back on through the steam. So this happens at a lot of facilities. In fact, I'd say this is incredibly common. I would be shocked if you're at a facility where this doesn't happen. It's so common. But the good news is that these stains, they don't represent an immediate risk to patients, and they can be mitigated through water quality. And if you can't get the water quality completely under control, don't panic. It can be mitigated through just regular care and maintenance. So speaking of water quality, this is what makes staining so difficult to track down, because water quality can and will vary from location to location. Even within the same geographical area. The struggles that my local facility has with water quality will be different than the struggles that the hospital has on the other side of town, because water quality does vary wildly just based on geographical location, and it can even vary wildly at the same location just based on seasonality. For example, we had one facility that was really struggling with staining, but it was just immediate. Out of nowhere, they had no issues, and then one one day they just started having staining issues, and it would be really bad for a couple of months, and then it would just go away on its own. And we did some investigation, and we figured out that actually the water quality at that location changed because at a certain point in the year, everybody in town was emptying their swimming pools. And because they were emptying their swimming pools, there was a lot more chlorine being introduced into the municipal water supply. And, that was still within the bounds for their drinking water, but it was really messing up their instruments in the process. So like even just weird things, if you're in an area where it snows a lot, you're going to deal with this when you have snow melt. So it can change just based on the season. You can actually get municipal water reports to find out what's going on with your water, but it's very difficult because, number one, municipal water reports are always a year behind. So if I go to my city's municipal water website, I can get a report, but it will not tell me the water report for 2021. It will probably tell me the water report for 2020. So it's always looking back a year. And so it's not really helpful for understanding what the condition of your water is right now. And they also tend to give you results in terms of a range. So, they'll have this range set up and they'll tell you, okay, we're doing kind of in this area over this period of time. So it's okay for getting a basic idea, but it's not going to tell you specifically what's going on with your water right now. So if you want to find out what's going on with your water right now, you have to do regular water testing as a result. So this is a picture from a document from AAMI called TIR34. So you've probably heard of ST79. ST79 is kind of like the Bible of steam reprocessing, steam sterilization and reprocessing of instruments. AAMI makes several different books of standards, and they even have this other group that's called Technical Information Reports. So they're not standards. They're just there to be helpful information. And they have one on water quality and as it pertains to instrument reprocessing, and it's called TIR34. And the interesting thing about TIR34 is that after a little bit of a debate, I think it has become apparent that TIR34 needs to be elevated from being just a nice kind of helpful bit of information to actually being a standard. And so Amy has announced that it will become a standard sometime, hopefully next year. So it will be called ST108. So they have the information. They said this is really important for facilities to know, so we're going to elevate it. We're going to take it to a standard. Now, I don't know specifically what's going to be in ST108, but I know what's in TIR34, and that's what we're going to look at in this particular next couple of slides. So what TIR34 says is that it lines out what the quality of water should be for when you're reprocessing instruments. So they kind of divide into two groups. You've got your utility water, which is your flushing, washing, and your rinsing. And then you've got your critical water, which is used for your final rinse, and then especially for your steam quality. And like I said, I think a lot of facilities get this for their final rinse, but then they go right and put it into an autoclave where the steam is coming from a house boiler, and it's just municipal water quality. And so you can see the difference in quality that's required, especially for like hardness there. That in for utility water, there's a tolerance of 150 cubic milliliters of hardness, of mineralization. But then when it comes to that final rinse and that steam, it's supposed to be less than 1. So significantly higher quality water needs to be utilized, and that's the only way you're ever going to prevent staining from happening. And that's why staining is basically common all over the United States, because very few facilities are actually able to achieve this. So this is a sample of a municipal water report. This came from some work I did in Jacksonville, Florida. They were having an issue with staining, and it was kind of the same issue. This is exactly what a municipal water report would look like. And the main reason I wanted to kind of draw your attention to this is there's one particular part of the report that really just made my point, and so that's why I kept it. But you can see this has to do with a particular contaminant called chlorides, And in their sample set, which was only 2 months, so this is between February and April of 2017, their range of results was anywhere from 9 to 329, right? That's how much variance was found in their water supply in 2 months. So massive variability there going on. And, and when it's over that 329, like that's actually outside of their own limits for drinking water. So this is kind of a no-no for them and their people, number one. But even when it was at its lowest point of 9, it was still not good enough for instrument reprocessing according to TIR 34. But I guarantee you, every single facility in that area was using that water to reprocess their instruments. Again, the primary thing that it's going to affect is just what kind of stains are ending up on your instruments. And so if you've got, tap water being utilized, especially in your autoclaves, you're going to see stain. There's no way around it. Like, you're going to see it. And so the only thing you can do at that point is mitigate it through regular care and maintenance to get that stain off of there. Now, I already mentioned the dangerous form of staining, which is old bioburden. So for, if you're in the OR and you look at an instrument that you're about to hand to the physician and you say, what is that? It's like this brown sticky substance. That is not just a mineral stain, that is bioburden staining. And that instrument is absolutely not safe for patient care. What happens to bioburden when it is left on instruments and then run through the autoclave is it essentially gets baked onto the instrument. It becomes very, very difficult to get off at that point, and it does carry proteins along with it. So this is a massive risk to patients. So if you see that brown or black, it usually is black, sticky substance on the instruments, you need to get that out of your OR. There's a very significant risk to patients from that. So, go to the sterile processing facility and tell them, listen, this is a big risk. This is a process failure. We need to figure out how this happened, how we can prevent it from happening in the future. I already mentioned other chemical residues like the residue from marking tapes, for example. Marking tape in particular is kind of in the crosshairs of the Joint Commission in particular. We've heard of several facilities being threatened to shut down over poor quality of the instrument taping. My personal vote is taping is a bad idea. I can't tell you not to use it because ST79 still says that it's okay. But the main thing about it is that it has to be maintained in good condition. That's like the main key piece here. So if you have instruments with tape on them, that tape must be in good condition. If it is old, if it's flaking off, if it has been applied improperly, it has to be removed. Because it is also a risk to patients. And then, of course, when you take that tape off, especially if it's been there for a while, you got to pay really close attention to what it leaves behind, because it can leave that kind of just gross residue behind, and that can carry bioburden along with it. So pay attention to your tape, and if your tape is not in good condition, get it replaced immediately, or move on to something that doesn't leave, kind of those residues behind, like, for example, laser marking. I mentioned earlier kind of this rare form of staining called galvanic oxidization. Essentially what this is when two different metal types, so if you think about like your vascular instrument sets, you've probably got titanium instruments in with stainless steel instruments. Normally that's not really a big deal until you put it into an ultrasonic cleaner, and if that ultrasonic cleaner has too much enzymatic added to it, it creates kind of this situation where bits of the metal can actually flake off and end up on the other metal. It's kind of weird, but it's called mirroring sometimes. But it is a very unusual form of staining. It kind of gives it like a rainbowish appearance, and that's really about the only way it can happen. So kind of a weird one, but I have seen it on a couple of occasions. Big takeaway here is regular water quality testing is really helpful to know what's going on with your instruments specifically, and then you've got to get those things removed regularly, or it's going to build up to a point where it can begin to affect the functionality of that instrument. If you have hard water mineralization buildup in the box locks of your scissors. That scissor is not going to cut as smoothly as it should. If you've got it built up in your hemostats, it's going to be hard to move. If you've ever gotten a pair of needle holders and you go to clamp down on the suture, and it's like it's grinding in the process as it goes, right? Well, why is that? Well, it could be hard water mineralization that is caught up inside that box lock, and it's affecting that instrument's ability to work. So, this is a constant battle. The reality is you're probably never going to win the battle with staining. It is one that you have to just fight. And so, send those instruments out regularly for preventive care to get those stains off of them and keep them from building up. Have your autoclaves cleaned regularly. If your autoclave looks like the one on the left, I promise you it is not functioning as efficiently as it should, because there's just so much other things that the steam has to work through to get to the instruments, and the steam actually can pick up mineralization from the walls of the autoclave and redeposit it onto the instruments as well. So, if your autoclave looks like the one on the left, I promise you, you probably got stains on your instruments as well. Other things to be aware of, like I said, newer instruments tend to be more vulnerable to this type of damage. Pay attention to construction projects that are going on in your facility. If your facility is changing water pipes, 2 blocks up, but if it affects the flow of water, I promise you, you will see an increase in staining or a change. So be very mindful about what kind of repairs or what kind of construction is being done. I had one facility one time that contacted us because again, it's kind of the same thing. Like out of nowhere, they had staining, and we did a lot of investigation and figured out that the city was replacing a water pipe, almost half a mile away upstream. And because they were doing that work, it was actually sending water through different pipes than were normally used to feed into the facility, and it changed the water quality, and that resulted in extra staining. So weird things like that can absolutely have an impact on the kind of staining you get. Another one that's kind of a little odd is magnetization on instruments. Your instruments can pick up free iron from the water, and this will happen when your instruments have a magnetic charge. So they're used with things like mini C-arms, or they're used with mag pads. They pick up a little bit of that magnetic charge, and then they begin to attract free iron from the water that they're being exposed to. And then what that will look like, that actually is rust, but it's rust that's sitting on top of the instrument rather than coming from in the instrument. We'll talk a little bit more about rust. So speaking of rust, what is rust? We already covered that. That is the iron. It wants to form with oxygen, and it wants to create this iron oxide. It's the most stable form of iron in the environment. It wants to do this. And because 70% of your instrument is made out of iron, as that iron oxide is being created, the iron base that gives it its strength is dying. And so rust is catastrophic damage to the instruments. When you see this beginning to happen, the first thing you'll notice might be the rust itself, but you also might see lots of little black specks on the instrument. And you might even run your finger over them and you don't feel anything there, but you can see what looks like little black dots on the instrument. Well, those are called pits. And what a pit is an area where the chromium oxide layer that's supposed to protect the instrument has begun to break down. And because it's broken, it's letting that oxygen there into the iron base, and that instrument is creating the rust. It's binding with the oxygen, and when it does this, as it does this, it creates these pits. And if you put a pit under a microscope, this is what it looks like there in the picture. It's a hole in the instrument, and at that point, that instrument is no longer safe for patient care. First off, can you clean inside that hole? No, you cannot. That is absolutely an area where bacteria will kind of get inside, and they'll begin to form their little colonies and their biofilms, and it's impossible to clean at that point. But then on top of that, because the iron base of the instrument is falling apart, that instrument is no longer structurally sound either. So this is the instrument that you're going to hand it to the physician, hand a hemostat to them, they're going to go to clamp down on a blood vessel, and that instrument is going to snap in half right there in their hands. Why did that happen? Well, because the iron base of the instrument is breaking down. And because it is no longer structurally safe, it is no longer going to function in the way that they need it to during the procedure, and it's going to be a massive risk to those patients. Now, how does this happen? Well, chromium oxide, you heard me sing its praises. It's an amazing material. It's what makes stainless steel, but chromium oxide, it's like Superman. It has one weakness, and for Superman, it's kryptonite, but for chromium oxide, it is chloride ions. And the most common place where chloride ions kind of get to instruments is through salt. And if you live up north, where it snows a lot and they put a lot of salt on the roads, you're already familiar with this. This happens all the time to your cars, and you know that you have to get the underside of your car in particular cleaned regularly to prevent this exact reaction from happening, because the chromium, the passive layer on the stainless steel gets exposed to those chloride ions and salt. And when that happens, it begins to break down, exposing the iron underneath, and that iron just gobbles up as much oxygen as it can, and it begins to create iron oxide or rust in the process. Now, that's through salt on the roads. Where do you get salt in a surgical procedure? Well, the obvious one is saline. Every single procedure uses saline, right? And so if those instruments are allowed to let saline dry onto the instruments, it is breaking down that chromium oxide layer that protects the instruments. So this is when this is really critical for OR personnel in particular to understand that if you are allowing instruments to dry with saline on them, you'd be shocked at how many times I talk to scrub techs who think that cleaning the instruments, doing their point of use care with saline is the proper way of doing things. Well, yes, you can get the bioburden off when you do that, but you're just leaving behind the most awful substance you can for the quality of your instruments. You leave that on your back table wet with saline, and as in that OR air is really dry, it dries up, it evaporates the water, and it leaves behind the salt. And the salt goes to work breaking down that chromium oxide layer. And so generally speaking, when people come to me and they say, we have a problem with pitting in our facility, I say your number one location you've got to go to is point of use cleaning in your facility. The second one that's kind of close to it, and very, very similar, is blood being allowed to dry onto your instruments? When you push them into decontamination, how long does it take for your sterile processing people to get it into the wash and get that stuff off of there? Because blood too has a lot of stuff in it, and as it dries, it leaves behind all the minerals, and one of those minerals that's in every one of our blood is salt. And that salt will go to work and it will start eating away at that chromium oxide layer and making the iron underneath vulnerable. So this is, like I said, this is why point of use cleaning is so critical. We have to rinse off the instruments with sterile water during the procedure, not saline. We have to keep those instruments moist, and we have to keep the blood from drying, because when the blood dries, the salt that's in your blood starts to work on them. And then in decontamination, we got to get those through and get that gross decontamination done as quickly as possible. Now, there are a few other sources where rusting can begin. Again, not quite as common, in fact, nowhere near as common as issues with point of use care. But abrasion damage, for example, if you've got instruments that are too tight, as they're kind of grinding against each other, that scraping method absolutely will damage that chromium oxide layer, and then again allow the air to get to the iron underneath and go to work. So improperly maintained instrumentation with, if you've got some that are too tight and you're having to work against them, send them out for repair, because that's absolutely going to lead to some of that abrasion damage that can lead to rusting. A few other minor sources to be aware of: the free iron, like I talked about. Free iron actually sits on top of the chromium oxide layer, and it comes from other sources. Sometimes where you see this is when single-use instrumentation somehow makes it into your instrument sets. And when this happens, you'll open the instrument set and it'll look like rust has just been like sneezed all over the instruments. I mean, it's just like spattered all over it. you're like, what in the world happened to this instrument set? Well, chances are you've got one instrument in there that is a single-use instrument, and because it does not have the layer of chromium oxide that the other instruments do, it is like dying. And as it's dying, it's just spitting out this rust all over the rest of the instruments. And so that's a very, it's a cause for concern, number one, because obviously it's a single-use instrument that you got to get out of there because it was never made to be reused. So it's obviously not structurally sound. But as that rust sits on top of those other instruments, it can eventually start to eat through that chromium oxide layer and eventually get through to the rest of the instrument. So when you see that, go ahead and send that whole set out for repair. Find that single-use instrument. Sometimes it can be caused by magnetization, but most of the time it's being caused by some instrument that is in the process of dying, and it's kind of trying to take the other instruments with it. All right, that's the presentation, and I'm going to open it up for Q&A. And as I finish, I want to say two things. One is I know you guys probably don't hear thank you enough for the jobs that you do, the work that you do. That's kind of the result of your patient, the people you take care of. They're usually asleep, and so they don't get to say thank you to you very much. So we'll be the ones that say thank you for what you do. Thank you for taking care of patients. I can't say enough how much I appreciate the work that you do. And the second thing is I want to give a big shout out to one of the upcoming panelists later in the day. Elizabeth Marrero is going to be on the panel discussion, and she actually works at Arkansas Children's, which is about 30 miles from where I am. And she actually gave me one of my first speaking opportunities that I had. I think it was actually my third one that I had ever gotten. And she allowed me to come to Arkansas Children's and talk to them about sterile processing and some of the challenges that the industry faces. And so I've always been grateful to her for that opportunity. And so I want to make sure that everybody tunes in, that when she's talking about collaboration with infection prevention, she means it. And I have been a great beneficiary of that kindness. So I wanted to give her a shout out as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa and open it up for Q&A.
All right, awesome. We actually did get some great questions. The first one is weekly cleaning of the autoclave recommended by staff or yearly cleaning by professionals?
This is a good one. Both. You can do both. The weekly cleaning is really just kind of trying to keep things in check, keeping it from getting too out of control. But again, it's kind of like it's fighting an unwinnable war. So you're just kind of keeping it in check. But the annual, or maybe even every 6 months, depending upon how bad your facility's water supply is, that's where you're actually going to see the majority of the staining get taken off. So you really got to do both.
Another question is, what about when the OR pours sodium chloride on the dirty instruments?
Yeah, it's a bad idea. Yeah. Anytime sodium chloride is getting put onto instruments, through through saline, like that is absolutely going to do a lot of damage to those instruments over time. And I will say, actually, I forgot to tell one fun story about other sources of chloride ions. One of the facilities I managed a long time ago, we had a kind of a process in place where, it's for our labor and delivery department. And they would use the instruments, and then they would take them to their dirty room, and they would they'd clean them, do the initial kind of basic point of use cleaning, and then put the instruments into an enzymatic bath, and then load those into a container. And we would come and pick the containers up like about, usually twice a day. Unless there were like a lot of babies being born or something like that. But that was kind of our process, and it worked just fine. But there was one scrub tech in particular who bless her heart, she thought she was helping us. And she didn't know how enzymatic worked, but she knew that she wanted to get the instruments clean. So she decided to add bleach to the mix, where she even got bleach in a facility, I have no idea. That was a whole nother question that got asked. But if you look at the chemical description of bleach, it is sodium hypochlorite. And so it's got double chloride ions. It's got it in the sodium and in the hypochlorite part, the chlor. You've got double doses of chloride ions. And so she was adding bleach to the mix. And it did not take us long to notice, because the first time we went and picked those instruments up, we had 2 C-section sets that were completely destroyed. I've never seen anything like it. Pits completely straight through every single instrument in the set, completely ruined all of them. So yes, chloride ions will absolutely do damage to your instruments, especially if they're in a very concentrated form. They will do more. And so, yeah, anytime you've got those chloride ions being left behind on instruments, you're going to see an increase in pitting 100%.
So we have another question. How about the instrument color coding? Such as putting tape on, they're wanting to know, is that safe for patient use?
So it's a complex question. ST79 says that it is still safe, but again, the big key to this is the tape has to be applied properly and it has to be maintained properly. And if you've ever had tape on instruments, you know it just does not take long for that tape to start looking pretty cruddy. And so it is a ongoing and time-consuming process to keep that tape in good condition, because as soon as it stops being in good condition, it begins to be a very serious risk to patients. And the same is true for like color dipping. We call it ring dipping sometimes, where you put the color around the ring handle part of the instrument. And the groups who will be the worst ones about giving it up will be your outside facilities, right? So, the cath lab, labor and delivery, radiology, those outside departments because like they want to make sure they get their instruments back. And this is the way they make sure they know that they're getting their instruments back and they're not being added to the dirty OR. Ugh. And so they get really angry about that. But the reality is that it just does not take long for those instruments to get in really bad shape. And at that point, yes, it becomes a very significant patient issue. And I think this is why the Joint Commission in particular is taking a very hard look at this. And if you're at a facility where you've got a lot of tape on your instruments, or you've got a lot of ring dipping on your instruments, it's difficult to change that tape out. It is time consuming. I was at one of the facilities I was a technician at, used a lot of tape. And when we had an instrument set that needed to have the tape removed, like it was a multi-hour commitment to take all the tape off and reapply new tape. I mean, you're talking about, you might get like 2 or 3 sets done in an entire work day at best. So it's a big time commitment to do that. And that's why most technicians just kind of ignore it, because they can't take the time to do it. And as they ignore it, it gets worse and worse, and then it becomes that significant risk to patients. And so if it were me and I'm in your position and the OR scrub tech, if I pull an instrument out of a set and I see tape that's kind of flaking off or sticking up or something, I'm getting that instrument out immediately.
Yeah, in fact, I remember on the Beyond Clean Instagram site, there is a picture of one of those dipped instruments under magnification. You can see the degradation of the steel underneath.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's another good question here. Should instruments that start showing signs of rusting be immediately removed and replaced? How can you tell the difference between blood and rust on an instrument?
Well, the OR mantra is, when in doubt, throw it out. And I think that's a good mantra to have, because if it's me or one of my loved ones on the table, I want to be sure. We're not making assumptions here. And so if I've got a question that I don't know if this is rust or if this is bioburden, the safest thing you can do is replace it. Get it out. We'll deal with the question later. Now, when you get it into, more calm circumstances, so not in an active OR, that's when we can kind of do some investigation to find out, is this bioburden? If it's bioburden, we've got a process failure. We've got to, find whoever it was that, needed to spend more time on this instrument and make sure that they understand what's going on and what the risk is and all that sort of stuff. But if it's rust, that's a different process we might have to look at. And so the safest answer is get it out of there to make sure to be certain. And then we can investigate what's going on with it in another circumstance. I just don't feel like when you're in an OR during an active procedure, like that's not the question you should have to ask. Like you shouldn't have to investigate that. And so if it is a question, you should probably just move on to a different instrument set.
We've got a lot of questions. So do repair companies also check for instruments that are magnetic when repairing?
Yes, they should. Usually, you can tell when an instrument it has a magnetic charge on it because it'll actually stick to other instruments. Now, there is an instrument that can be used to actually test the magnetic charge of an instrument. It's called a Goss Meter, which, by the way, if you ever want some really entertaining Google results, Google Goss Meters, because apparently these things are also utilized to hunt ghosts. Anyway, weird stuff. So it's very difficult to find an actual legitimate Goss meter. But I have seen a few facilities that have them. We had one, and it is very helpful, especially when you're talking about particularly micro needle holders. That's kind of the biggest area where we see that you want to be very mindful about magnetic charges, because the sutures that are going to be utilized in those micro needle holders are tiny. And I mean, they're almost weightless, right? And so if you've got a magnetic charge on your needle holder and you go to grab that tiny little suture, it's going to like shoot the suture off the table. I mean, I've seen it. It's wild, but it's not good during a procedure. So yeah, that's something that should be noticed. And it's actually relatively easy to use a demagnetizer. If your facility doesn't have a demagnetizer, I think it's a good idea. But any reputable repair company will have a demagnetizer on their repair vehicle as well.
Will too much surgistain harm the instrument?
I don't know what surgistain is. Is that a product or?
Yeah, it's a product that's used to help take off rust and stains from an instrument.
Oh, okay. So yeah, it's like a deruster or something like that. Yes. Yeah, the bottle will give you the dilution requirements, and those do tend to be very caustic. And so use within those limits. Always make sure you're actually measuring how much is being used. Don't do one of those like just dump a bunch until it looks okay to you, because it is very caustic, and it becomes very difficult to rinse off as well. So yes, if you use in concentrations that are not recommended, they can do damage to instruments, yes.
Arthroscopic instruments are obviously inundated with saline during the procedure. Should those instruments be sent to SPD in sterile water?
Yes, it can be very helpful for them to be rinsed with sterile water. But you're right. And honestly, every procedure, inundate, urology instruments are bad about this too. Just getting absolutely soaked with saline just as a product of the procedure. And that's okay, because I mean, we're not going to get away from that, right? The big thing that we want to get away from is the saline being allowed to dry onto the instruments. And so this is why it's so important to make sure the instruments stay moist, and that if there are areas where the saline can be allowed to dry, it needs to be cleaned with sterile water or flushed with sterile water to get that salt off of there.
How do you get your department to stop using wire brushes to scrape off rust on instruments on the clean side?
Ooh, the most controversial question of all time, the use of the wire brush. So wire brushes do tend to be very, very controversial when it comes to this. If you have a wire brush that is designed specifically for stainless steel, that is a safe wire brush to use on your instruments. That's what it's made for. When it comes to metal on metal contact, the harder metal always wins. And so that's why it's really important that we only use the wire brushes that are designed specifically for surgical stainless steel, because if we get a wire brush that is made with harder wire than the stainless steel, it will destroy that instrument. That's that abrasion damage that we talked about. Like I've heard of facilities that thought that they were doing a really cool thing to save some money, so they were going down to Home Depot to buy their wire brushes because those only cost like $2 for a pack of 5, and the ones from one of the other companies, those cost like $10. So look at all this money we're saving. Yeah, but you're destroying your instrument in the process. So number one key is if you're using a wire brush, it has to be made specifically for use on stainless steel instrumentation. But then, how hard are you scrubbing too, right? So if you've got, bioburden that is just caked onto an instrument and you can't get it off without really grinding on that wire brush, that might say something about your point of use cleaning, right? Like, why is that bioburden being allowed to harden that much? It shouldn't be that difficult to get it off of there. So, I gotta tell you, the wire brush conversation, like, we could have a whole different presentation on that because that tends to be a very controversial one. I know some sterile processing technicians who would fight you those things.
And obviously only using the wire brushes in decontam.
Yeah, another biggie. And only using them on stainless steel too, right? I mean, if you're using them on insulation, insulated instruments like laparoscopic instruments, for example, you're absolutely going to damage the insulation as well. So, key piece here is you have to be using the right tools for the right job, or yes, you are going to see some damage.
Another question is the ST108 a recommendation or requirement for hospital and same-day surgery centers?
So it's going to be treated the same way ST79 is, right? So like that's kind of the standards through which inspection groups like the Joint Commission, for example, that's the standard they're going to inspect you to, unless your policies and procedures say otherwise. So if you say your facility says, we don't follow ST79, we follow this set of documents, then that's you won't have to worry about that. But generally speaking, most facilities will say we follow the recommendations of AAMI when it comes to reprocessing. And if your facility says that, then yes, they are going to be a requirement. If you don't follow ST79, you have your own policies and procedures. Just know that when you're inspected, they're probably going to ask lots of questions about, well, how do you determine what is okay? What is this based on? What's your evidence? And they're going to get really down into the weeds and wanting to know, like, okay, if you're not using this authority, what authority are you using and why?
And we got a couple of comments. Brushes are for cleaning and need to be removed from the clean and prep side. And another comment, stain removers need to be measured properly as well as follow the instructions for time frame for soaks.
Yep.
And then another question here, if the OR insists on using saline to pre-clean instruments, can that contribute to formations of bioburden?
It won't contribute to the formation of bioburden, but it will contribute to the formation of rust, because that saline will begin to eat through the chromium oxide, and when it eats through the chromium oxide, it exposes the instrument, the iron underneath, to the air, and that's where the rust comes from. So bioburden is a separate conversation. It won't create bioburden, but it will create rust most likely.
Yeah, and it can also increase the risk of bioburden accumulation in those spots if you got pitting and so forth.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
And another question, why are there white spots on instruments? And they're wondering if it's
white spots. Yeah, white spots, again, that's probably a hard water buildup, most likely. And if I had to guess, I would say it's probably something like potassium, but without doing water testing, I can't say for certain. I will say that occasionally, especially if you're seeing that coming out of your washer, it could mean that you've got too much enzymatic being used on your instruments, and it's having a hard time getting rinsed off of the instruments. So that happens sometimes, but you shouldn't notice that as much coming out of the autoclave. You would notice that coming out of the washers. But again, white powdery appearance tends to be something like potassium or magnesium or something like that, and you'd have to do your own specific water quality testing to know what it is. But my initial gut reaction would be hard water.
Well, we had so many awesome questions that we weren't able to get to, but don't worry. Mike's going to have a copy of every single question. You can reach out directly to him and he will answer them. Thank you so much for such a great discussion. We are out of time, but if you have, there will be a short 15-minute break before the next session. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you for a discussion dedicated to improving the safety of orthopedic instrument in the next session. And thanks, Mike. It was wonderful to see you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.